The room smelled like roasted turkey and money. Cherry Creek Country Club had been decorated for Thanksgiving the way people decorate when they want others to notice white linen, brass candlesticks, arrangements of dried wheat, and orange peonies that no one had touched. I had been sitting at the far end of the long table for 40 minutes, watching the candles burn down and counting the people in the room. There were 43. I know because I counted twice. Michael was standing when he said it. He had pushed back his chair and stood up the way young men stand when they want the room to pay attention, and the room did pay attention. Conversations stopped. Forks went still. A woman named Carol, one of my sister-in-law's friends, someone I had met exactly once, at a garden party 6 years ago, turned to look at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression people wear when they are watching something they cannot stop. Michael said, "Leave, Dad. You're not welcome here." He said it clearly. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. I noticed that Sarah, his girlfriend, looked down at her plate the moment the words left his mouth. I noticed that my sister-in-law, Patricia's younger sister, the woman who had organized this dinner and invited me herself 3 weeks ago, by text said nothing at all. She picked up her wine glass and held it with both hands. I did not ask Michael why. I did not raise my voice. I have been a civil engineer for 34 years, and one thing that work teaches you, if you pay attention, is that a structure under pressure will tell you everything you need to know if you are quiet enough to listen. I was quiet. I listened. I folded my napkin along its original crease and set it beside my plate. I pushed my chair back slowly. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked the length of the table toward the exit. I did not look at Michael. I did not look at Sarah. I looked at the door, and I walked to it, and I went through it. The valet brought my car in 4 minutes. I tipped him and drove north on University Boulevard toward home. The city was quiet the way Denver gets quiet on Thanksgiving evening. Streets empty, lights low, the mountains invisible behind the dark. I drove the whole way without the radio. By the time I pulled into the driveway on Clarkson Street, I had already decided what needed to happen. Patricia used to say that I had a gift for building things that would outlast me. She meant it as a compliment. She was talking about bridges and retaining walls and the drainage systems I designed for subdivisions out along the Front Range structures that would still be doing their job 30 years after I was gone. I think about that now when I think about Michael, because I built something for him too, and I built it to last. And the problem was that he never once looked at the foundation to understand what was holding him up. 10 years ago, Michael was 18 years old and sitting across from me at the kitchen table on Clarkson Street with a printout of a coding boot camp in Boulder. He had already decided he wasn't going to college. He said it clearly and without apology, which I respected, and he wanted to know if I would help him get started. I told him yes. I meant it without conditions. Patricia had been gone 3 years by then, and Michael and I were still learning how to talk to each other in a house that felt too large for 2 people. I would have said yes to almost anything reasonable that kept us in the same orbit. We went to the bank together on a Thursday morning in October 2013. The account was listed under both our names, a joint checking account at First Western, the same branch where Patricia and I had banked since 1991. I explained to Michael that the arrangement was practical. I would transfer money in each month to cover his expenses while he was getting established, and he could see every transaction, every deposit, every withdrawal. Transparency. I told him. He nodded like a man who understood. He was 18. He understood what he wanted to understand. I paid his first month's rent on a studio apartment off Colfax, $840. I paid his enrollment fee for the boot camp. I paid the insurance on the used Honda Civic I helped him buy, a 2009 model with 112,000 miles and a slow leak in the rear left tire he never got fixed. I did these things because they were the right things to do, and because Patricia would have done them without being asked, and because Michael was my son and he was 22 years old and trying to build something. By the time he turned 24, he had a job. A real one, junior developer at a startup in the Rhino district, salary around $58,000 a year to start. He called me on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in a long time. Proud. Genuinely proud. I sat in the kitchen and listened to him describe the office and the team and the product they were building. And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I kept paying the bills from the joint account. The rent had gone up. He'd moved to a one-bedroom near Capitol Hill, $1,700 a month. The car note was $600. I didn't say anything about it because he didn't ask, and because I told myself he was still finding his footing, and because I had learned from 35 years of engineering that a structure needs time to settle before you test it. I found out what Michael was telling people about our arrangement through a man named Gary Solis, who had worked with me at the firm for 11 years, and whose son played in the same recreational soccer league as Michael. Gary mentioned it at lunch one afternoon in the spring of 2022 offhand, the way people mention things they assume you already know. He said his son had told him that Michael was one of the most financially independent guys he knew, that Michael had gotten himself set up entirely on his own, that his father had helped a little at the beginning, but that was years ago. Gary looked at me when he said it. I looked at my sandwich. I said, "That's good to hear." Gary nodded and moved on to something else, and I sat there and finished my lunch. And I thought about the $1,700 that had left the joint account 6 days earlier to cover Michael's rent. I did not call Michael that evening. I did not call him the next day either. I have found, in my work and in my life, that the worst thing you can do when you discover a structural problem is to react before you understand the full load. I started paying closer attention instead. I pulled up the account statements going back 18 months. I went through them the way I go through a project budget line by line, category by category, nothing assumed. Michael's salary had increased. By 2023, he was making $62,400 a year, which worked out to roughly $5,200 a month after taxes. A reasonable income for a 28-year-old in Denver. Not comfortable, but workable, if a person lived within it. He was not living within it. His monthly expenditures ran to approximately $7,800 rent at $1,800 a car payment and insurance at $600, food and groceries around $1,200, clothing and entertainment at $2,000, and credit card minimum payments that had crept up to $1,200 a month. The gap between what he earned and what he spent was $2,600 every single month. That gap had been filled, without interruption, by the joint account. By me, for 10 years. I had tried to address it directly, once. In August, the second week, a Thursday evening, I had called Michael and asked if he had time to sit down with me and go over some numbers. Not an accusation, a conversation. I had done the same thing with junior engineers on projects where the budget was drifting, and it had always been more productive than waiting for the overrun to become visible. Michael had said he was busy that week. I said I understood and that we could find another time. He said sure, absolutely. He'd look at his calendar. He never looked at his calendar. I didn't push. I told myself there would be a better moment. There wasn't. By October, David Hartley was calling me about a credit line I hadn't signed. It was the credit card statement that made me pick up the phone. In September 2023, I received a call from David Hartley at First Western. David was the branch manager, a careful, measured man of 45 who had handled our accounts since 2018. He called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing drainage specs for a project in Aurora. He said he was calling as a courtesy, that he wanted me to be aware before anything went to collections. He said the credit card linked to Michael's account had exceeded its limit. The outstanding balance was $47,000. I asked David to read me the transaction history for the last 6 months. He did. I wrote down the figures on the back of a project envelope. When he finished, I thanked him and told him I would be in touch. I sat at my desk for a while after that. Outside the window, the mountains were clear, one of those sharp October days in Denver when the air has no weight to it and the peaks look close enough to touch. Patricia used to love those days. She would make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and just look at them for a few minutes before starting whatever she had planned. I thought about Michael at 18, sitting across from me with that boot camp printout, and I thought about what I had believed I was building. I had thought I was building a bridge, something temporary, designed to carry him from one side to the other while the permanent structure went up. What I had actually built was a floor, and he had been standing on it for 10 years without ever once looking down to see what it was made of. That's when I understood my son believed he was independent. He was not. He was living in a fantasy, and I had been enabling it. The party was his idea. Michael called me on a Thursday in early October and said he wanted to have some friends over at my house. His old room was bigger than his apartment, he said, and there was more parking. He said it like it was a reasonable request. I said yes. I had been saying yes for 10 years. They arrived on a Saturday evening in the third week of October. 7 of them, young men and women in their late 20s, who worked in tech and talked about it the way engineers used to talk about bridges, like the thing they were building was the most important structure in the world. I made myself useful in the kitchen and stayed out of the way. That was a habit I had developed over the years. Patricia used to tease me about it. She said I had the instincts of a man who always knew when to leave a room. She meant it as a compliment. I had started to wonder if it had cost me something. I was rinsing glasses at the sink when I heard Michael's voice shift into the register he used when he was performing. It was a register I recognized. He had used it at his high school graduation, at his college orientation, at every dinner where he wanted someone to be impressed. I turned off the water and stood still. He was talking about his startup. He was explaining something about machine learning to a woman named Jess, who nodded with the careful attention of someone who was interested but not yet convinced. Then Michael said something about funding, about runway, about the gap between what old industries understood and what new ones were building. And then he said, loudly enough, that the kitchen doorway was no barrier at all. My dad's a civil engineer. Good man. Great at what he does. But that's the thing. He builds things that already existed. Roads, bridges. Same stuff they were building 50 years ago. He doesn't understand what we're doing here. That's not a criticism. It's just a different world. There was a small laugh from the group, not unkind, the kind of laugh that agrees without thinking about it. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I folded it and set it on the counter. I counted the seconds the same way I used to count rebar spacing on a site inspection methodically, without emotion, because the numbers mattered and the feelings did not. I counted to 11. Then I went back to the refrigerator and got myself a glass of water and drank it standing at the window, looking out at the driveway where Michael had learned to ride a bicycle in the summer of 2001. He didn't know I'd heard, or he knew and decided it didn't matter. Either way, by 9 o'clock, he was saying goodnight to his friends at the front door with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything. I told him to drive safe. He said he would. He left without helping me clean up. I called Robert Chen the next morning at 8:15. Robert had been my attorney for 19 years. We had worked together on 3 property disputes and 1 contract disagreement that had taken 14 months to resolve. He was the kind of lawyer who answered his own phone before his assistant arrived, which I had always taken as a sign that he understood the value of being the first person in the room. I told him I needed to understand my legal position on the joint account. I told him the account had been open for 10 years, that my name was the primary on the paperwork, and that I had been the sole depositor for the last 7. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "As primary account holder, you have the right to freeze or close the account at any time. The other party would be notified, not consulted." He paused. "I'd recommend documenting your ownership history before you move. And James, be prepared for the response to be significant." I told him I understood. I told him I'd have the documentation ready within 2 weeks. He said, "I've known you a long time. I know you don't make calls like this without thinking them through." I told him that was correct. We scheduled a follow-up for the first week of November. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked the way I had always worked methodically, without announcement. I printed 5 years of transaction records from the joint account and spread them across the drafting table in my study, the same table where I had reviewed load calculations for the Morrison Street overpass in 2019. I went through the records line by line. I calculated the total Michael had drawn over 60 months, the rent supplements, the insurance payments, the 3 transfers he had described to Sarah's family as investments from a business account. I cross-referenced them against his stated income. The numbers told a very clear story, and I wrote it down in a single-page summary, the way I would write a structural report: facts, figures, no editorializing. I also wrote down the dates. Every conversation where Michael had described himself as financially independent. Every dinner where he had talked about building something on my own. I had a good memory for dates. It was a professional habit. Engineers remember when things were built because they need to know when things might fail. I called David Hartley at the bank on November 8th. David was the branch manager, a careful man, methodical in the way that people who work with other people's money tend to become. I had spoken with him twice before, once about a wire transfer and once about a discrepancy in a statement. He remembered both conversations. I told him I wanted to schedule an account action for November 28th. I told him I would bring the ownership documentation in person. I told him to have the freeze authorization form ready. There was a pause on the line. David said, "That's a significant step. Mr. Calloway, you're certain?" I told him I was. He said he would have everything prepared. I thanked him and hung up. I had 3 weeks to watch my son live in his fantasy. I watched him brag about his independence. I watched him spend money he didn't have. And I said nothing. Silence, I had learned long ago, is sometimes the best teacher. David Hartley called me on a Tuesday morning, the week before Thanksgiving. I was at my drafting table reviewing load calculations for a retaining wall project in Lakewood, a straightforward job. The kind I could do without thinking too hard, which meant part of my mind was somewhere else entirely. The phone rang at 9:14. I know the time because I had just written it on the top corner of my worksheet, the way I've marked every working hour for 37 years. "Mr. Calloway," David said, "I need to discuss something with you directly. Are you in a position to talk?" I set down my pencil. "Go ahead." "I was reviewing the joint account activity this morning routine quarterly audit. I found something that I don't think you're aware of." He paused, and I heard the sound of papers being handled on his end. "Your son opened a secondary credit card linked to the joint account in July. The authorization requires 2 signatures for an account of this type. We only have one on file. Yours is not among them." I looked at the retaining wall calculations in front of me. The numbers were clean and precise. Everything in its right place, every load accounted for. I thought about that for a moment. "Can you document it?" I asked. "Already done," David said. "I'm sending you a PDF right now. The card was activated on July 15th. Current balance is $47,300. When you open the file, you'll see the transaction history. I reviewed it this morning. The charges are not work-related restaurants, retail, bars, nothing that corresponds to any business expense category." I thanked him and told him I'd call back. I hung up, walked to my desk, and opened my laptop. The PDF loaded in under a minute. I'm an engineer. I read documents the way other people read maps. I go straight to the structure before I look at the details. The structure here was simple. A credit line opened without my signature, attached to an account I had funded for 8 years, carrying a balance of $47,300. I let that number sit in my head for a moment. Then I started reading the transactions. July 15th, card activated. July 16th, $2,100 at a clothing retailer on South Colorado Boulevard, a place I had driven past 100 times without ever going in, because there was nothing in my wardrobe that required spending $2,000 in a single visit. July 20th, $600 at a cocktail bar in Lodo. July 28th, $1,340 at an electronics store. August 3rd, $890 at a restaurant in Cherry Creek. The entries continued in that pattern for 4 months. Every 2 or 3 days, a charge. Some small, some not. None of them anything I would have authorized. I pulled up the spreadsheet I kept for household finances, not because I'm obsessive, but because I'm an engineer. And engineers track loads. I had Michael's salary information. He had told me himself, in one of our better conversations, that he was making $5,200 a month after taxes. I had no reason to doubt the number. I entered it into the spreadsheet and then entered the average monthly spend from the secondary card, $7,000. Then I added the charges from the primary joint account that I had been covering, approximately $800 per month. The math was not complicated. Michael was spending $700 to $800 every month and earning $500 to $200. The gap was $2,600 every single month, and the gap had been growing since July. I sat with that for a while. The retaining wall calculations were still on my drafting table. I didn't go back to them. My phone rang again at 10:47. David. Mr. Calloway, I should have mentioned this in my first call. There's one more thing. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has learned to deliver bad news without inflection, a skill I recognized because I had developed it myself years ago when I worked on infrastructure projects where the news was often structural failure. Your son attempted to open a third credit card last week. A separate institution, not us. The application was declined. The reason given was over-limit status. He's already at his credit ceiling. I asked David how he knew this. The declined application triggered a soft inquiry on the joint account. He said, "It flagged in our system. We're required to notify the primary account holder when that happens." I thanked him again. He asked if there was anything else I needed before the 28th. I told him no. He said he'd have the paperwork ready. I told him I knew he would. After I hung up, I stayed at my desk for a long time. The office was quiet. My drafting table was to my left, the window behind it looking out onto the street. There was a bare-branched cottonwood outside that I had watched for 11 years. It had been young when Patricia was alive, and now it was tall enough to block the upper half of the window in summer. In November, it was just bones. I looked at it for a while. I thought about July. Michael had opened that card in July, 1 week after we'd had dinner together at a barbecue place on Colfax, a place he had chosen, a place where we had talked for almost 2 hours about his job, his apartment, his plans. He had seemed fine. He had seemed, in fact, more than fine. He had seemed confident in a way I had noticed and quietly marked as something new. I had thought, sitting across from him that evening, that maybe he was finding his footing, that maybe the years of support were finally producing something stable. He had opened the card the following week. He lied. That is the word I kept coming back to as I sat in my office with the PDF open on my screen. Not mistake, not oversight, not poor judgment. He lied. He had signed a document that required my signature, and he had not asked for it. He had opened a line of credit against an account I owned and funded, and he had said nothing. He had spent $47,300, that specific number, clean and documented, and he had looked me in the face at dinner and talked about his plans as if none of it existed. I have made a career out of reading structures. The way a beam bears weight, the way a foundation settles, the way a retaining wall holds against pressure, these things tell you everything about what's happening beneath the surface, if you know how to look. What I was looking at now was a structure that had been compromised from the inside, not recently, since July. My mother was in the living room when I came out of my office. She was 87 years old, and she had lived with me for 3 years, since her hip surgery had made the stairs in her own house impossible. She was watching the news with the volume turned low, the way she always did in the mornings. She looked up when I came in. "You look like you did the day the Hartfield project fell through," she said. "I'm fine, Mom." "You're not," she said, and turned back to the television. She had always been economical with words. My mother, 62 years of watching me, had made her accurate. I made coffee I didn't particularly want and stood at the kitchen counter. I thought about Michael at 22, when Patricia was still alive and he was finishing his first year of college, coming home for Thanksgiving with a confidence that was still new enough to be charming. I thought about him at 25, when Patricia was gone and he was in his first apartment, and I had added him to the joint account because it seemed like the right thing to do, a bridge. I had told myself, not permanent. A bridge until he was on his own. I thought about how 3 years had become 5, and 5 had become 8, and the bridge had become the road itself. I had watched him build a life on a foundation I was paying for, and I had not said anything because I had told myself it was love. And it was love. But love, I was beginning to understand, had allowed something else to grow alongside it. Something I had not named until David Hartley sent me a PDF on a Tuesday morning in November. He lied. That was the name of it. I did not call Michael. I did not send a message. I went back to my office and finished the retaining wall calculations because the wall needed to be built and the calculations needed to be right. And those two facts had nothing to do with what my son had done. I checked my numbers twice. I sent the file to the project engineer. Then I opened Robert Chen's contact in my phone and sent him a text, "Call me when you have a moment. Additional documentation to review." Robert called back within the hour. I read him the key figures from the PDF, the July activation date, the $47,300 balance, the declined third card application. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "That changes the picture somewhat," he said. "Yes," I said. "Are you still planning to proceed on the 28th? "I am." "Then I'd recommend we add this documentation to the file. It strengthens the position considerably." I told him to add it. He said he would have the updated paperwork ready by Friday. I thanked him and hung up. I went back to the window. The cottonwood was still there, bare and exact against the gray November sky. Somewhere across the city, Michael was living in a version of his life that he had constructed around a lie, a version in which he was independent and capable and in control, a version in which the $47,300 did not exist. A version in which my signature was not missing from a document it should have been on. I had 1 week before Thanksgiving. I was not angry. Exactly. Anger is a fast thing, and what I felt was slow, the particular weight of understanding something you had suspected but not confirmed, of having the structure finally show you the failure that was always there. I had built enough walls in my career to know that the crack is never where you first see it. The crack is always deeper and older, and the surface is just where it finally becomes visible. David had shown me the surface. I now knew where to look for the rest. I picked up my pencil and started on the next set of calculations. The numbers were clean. I made sure of that. I always do. The community center on Colfax Avenue hosts a neighborhood planning meeting on the third Thursday of every November. I have attended that meeting for 11 consecutive years. First, because my firm was involved in the drainage redesign along the corridor, and later because I had come to find the routine of it useful. Same folding chairs, same coffee urn that never quite reaches temperature, same faces, mostly, though the faces age the way all faces do gradually, and then suddenly. November 20th fell on a Thursday that year. I arrived at 6:15, signed the attendance sheet, and poured myself a cup of the coffee that was never quite hot enough. The room held perhaps 40 people, city planners, contractors, a few residents who had been attending since before I had. I knew most of them by name. Denver is a large city that operates in certain circles. Like a small town, you see the same people at the same events, and after enough years, you stop being surprised by who knows whom. Susan Blackwell was standing near the window on the east wall talking to a woman from the Parks Department, whose name I could not immediately place. I recognized Susan from a photograph Michael had shown me in September, a family dinner at a restaurant on Larimer Street, the four of them around a table. Sarah leaning toward Michael with her hand on his arm. Susan had the same posture in person as she did in the photograph, straight-backed, composed, the particular bearing of someone who has spent decades being the most organized person in any room she entered. I did not approach her immediately. I refilled my coffee. I listened to the opening remarks from the city planner running the meeting. I waited until the small group discussion portion of the agenda, when people began moving around the room, before I walked toward the window. She saw me before I reached her. She smiled a warm smile, genuine, the kind that arrives before the person has decided to perform it. "James Calloway," she said. "I was hoping I might run into you sometime. I'm Susan Blackwell, Sarah's mother." "I know," I said. "Michael showed me a photograph from September. It's good to meet you in person." We shook hands. She had the firm grip of someone who means it. "I have to say," she began, and her voice carried the particular warmth of a parent who has something pleasant to report. "I'm so glad Michael and Sarah found each other. He's a lovely young man, very focused, very driven." "He works hard," I said. That was true enough. "Sarah thinks the world of him." Susan glanced toward the window, then back at me. She told me something a few weeks ago that honestly impressed me. She said Michael mentioned that he's completely on his own now financially. No support from family. Said he'd reached a point where he didn't need it anymore. She paused, still smiling. I thought that was remarkable, honestly. At 28, not many young people can say that. I held my coffee cup with both hands. The coffee was not hot. I drank a small amount of it. He said that I asked. He did, quite directly. Apparently, Sarah said he was very clear about it, that he was self-sufficient, that he'd built something on his own terms. She tilted her head slightly. Sarah was genuinely inspired. She's been working on her own financial independence for the past few years, and she said Michael was an example of someone who'd actually done it. She even mentioned wanting to learn from him. I set my cup down on the windowsill. Outside, the streetlights along Colfax were coming on in sequence one, then the next, then the next, each one a few seconds behind the one before it. I have a particular habit, developed over 40 years of working with structures and systems, of measuring the distance between what a thing claims to be and what it actually is. A beam rated for a certain load, a foundation certified to a certain depth. The claim is always in the paperwork. The reality is always in the material. When those two things diverge, someone eventually gets hurt, and the only question is how far the divergence has gone before anyone notices. Susan, I said. I kept my voice even. I want to tell you something, and I want to be careful about how I say it, because I have a great deal of respect for you, and I think you deserve to have accurate information. Her expression shifted not dramatically, just a small adjustment around the eyes. The smile stayed, but it became uncertain. Michael is not financially independent, I said. He has not been for some time. I pay his rent on the apartment on Alameda. I pay his car note on the Audi. I cover his utilities and his renter's insurance. Those payments come out of a joint account that I established when he moved to Denver, specifically to help him get established. Susan did not speak immediately. She was looking at me the way people look at a document when they realize the numbers don't add up, not angry yet, just recalibrating. Michael earns approximately $5,200 a month from his current position. I continued. His actual monthly expenditures run closer to $7,800. I have been covering the difference. What I discovered last week through my bank, with the assistance of the branch manager, is that Michael also opened a secondary credit line attached to our joint account without my knowledge or authorization. The charges on that line total $47,000. The smile was gone now. Susan stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. That's not what he told Sarah. No, I said. I don't imagine it is. He said. She stopped again. I waited. I have learned, over a long career of reviewing project reports and financial disclosures, that when someone stops mid-sentence twice in a row, they are not searching for words. They are searching for a way to reconcile two things that cannot be reconciled. He was very specific, she said finally. Her voice was quieter now. Sarah asked him directly. She asked whether he was still receiving help from his father, and he said no. He said he'd been on his own for over a year. And he moved into the Alameda apartment 14 months ago, I said. I have paid rent on that apartment every month since he signed the lease. Susan looked out the window. The streetlights on Colfax were all on now, the sequence complete. A city bus moved through the intersection below us, its windows lit from inside. I have a daughter, she said, not quite to me. Then, more directly, I need Sarah to know this. That is entirely your decision, I said. I'm not asking you to do anything. I only wanted you to have accurate information. You deserve that, and so does Sarah. She turned back to me. The composure was still there. She was the kind of woman who did not easily lose her composure, but beneath it, I could see something working, the particular internal motion of someone revising a picture they had already framed and hung on the wall. Does Michael know you know? She asked. He knows about the bank account, I said. He does not know the full extent of what I've reviewed, and he doesn't know we've spoken. She nodded slowly. I appreciate you telling me, she said. I know this wasn't an easy conversation to start. No, I said. It wasn't. We stood there for a moment. Around us, the meeting had resumed its formal structure, Someone at the front of the room was presenting a slide about stormwater infrastructure. The coffee urn hummed against the back wall. "James," Susan said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you still—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Why are you still covering his expenses if you know what he's doing?" I thought about my mother, 87 years old, sitting in the chair by the front window every morning with her coffee and the newspaper she still reads in print. I thought about the evening 3 months ago when she had looked at me over her glasses and said, in the careful way she says things she has been thinking about for a long time, "James, there is a difference between helping a person and carrying them. You know the difference. You've always known it." I thought about Patricia and about the way she used to say that the hardest part of loving someone was knowing when the help had stopped being helpful. "I've been asking myself that," I said. "I think I've been waiting for the right moment to stop. I think I've been confusing patience with permission." Susan looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and said, "Sarah's going to be very upset." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be," she said. "She needs to know who she's with. That's more important than comfortable." We returned to our respective seats when the presentation resumed. I did not look at Susan again during the meeting, though I was aware of her across the room, the particular stillness of someone processing something large and unwelcome in a public space where processing must be done quietly. I drove home on Colfax, then south on Broadway, the same route I have driven for the better part of 2 decades. The mountains were invisible in the dark, though I knew exactly where they were. There is a quality to Western darkness that Eastern darkness doesn't have, a sense of scale behind the black, of something enormous that has not gone away simply because you can no longer see it. My mother was asleep when I got home. I checked the thermostat, 68 degrees, where she likes it, and sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on more than the light above the stove. I had a notepad in front of me that I did not write on. I thought about Michael at 22, moving into his first apartment, a studio off South Broadway, the kind of place where the radiator made noise all winter and the parking was 2 blocks away. I had helped him carry boxes up a narrow staircase on a Saturday in August, and afterward we had eaten sandwiches on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. He had been proud that day, genuinely proud. I had seen it in the way he kept looking around the empty room, taking inventory of something he had claimed for himself. That was the Michael I had been trying to protect, not the Michael who charged $47,000 to an account that wasn't his, or the Michael who told a woman he loved that he was someone he was not. I had been protecting a version of my son that Michael himself had quietly abandoned, and I had not let myself see it clearly until the numbers made it impossible to look away. Susan left that conversation shaken. I knew she would tell Sarah, and I knew Sarah would tell Michael. By the time Thanksgiving came, Michael would be walking into that dining room as someone whose entire identity was a lie. He just didn't know it yet. I turned off the stove light and went to bed. The house was quiet. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car started and pulled away, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of my room before disappearing. I lay there in the dark and thought about what my mother had said, and about the difference between helping a person and carrying them, and about the particular kind of love that knows when to put something down. I had carried long enough. Thanksgiving was 4 days away. The Cherry Creek Country Club had been decorated for the season. I noticed that when I walked in white tablecloths, small arrangements of dried corn and burgundy chrysanthemums, candles already lit at 7 in the evening. The room held 43 people arranged across 6 round tables, and the noise of it was the particular noise of people who are comfortable together, voices overlapping, glasses touching. Michael had reserved a table near the center window. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, his hair cut recently. Sarah sat to his left. She looked up when I came in, and something moved across her face. Not surprise. Not quite before she looked back down at her menu. I took the empty chair across from them. Michael smiled at me. It was a careful smile, the kind that doesn't reach the corners of the eyes. I had seen that smile before, in project meetings, on faces of men who had already decided something and were waiting for the room to catch up. I picked up my menu and said nothing. The dinner proceeded the way these dinners do. Soup first, then salad, then the main course arriving in stages. I spoke with the man to my right, a colleague of Michael's named Greg, who worked in cloud infrastructure and talked about a ski trip he was planning in January. I listened. I asked a question or two. The candles burned down a quarter inch. Michael, across the table, was talking with more animation than usual, leaning forward, making a point with his fork, laughing at something Sarah said. But every few minutes he glanced at her in a way that wasn't quite easy, a small checking motion, like a man who has left something on the stove. Susan Blackwell was seated at the adjacent table, close enough that I could hear her voice when the room quieted between courses. She had arrived with her husband and two other couples, and she had greeted me when I came in with a warmth that was genuine and also careful. We had spoken once since our conversation in her kitchen, briefly, by phone. She knew what I knew. She was watching her daughter. I was watching my son. The main course was cleared. A server I hadn't seen before refilled water glasses down the length of the table. Michael set down his fork. He picked up his wine glass, then set it down again without drinking. He looked around the table once, and then he stood up. The room didn't go completely silent immediately. It took a few seconds, people finishing sentences, a laugh fading before the shift registered. Michael was standing. He had the posture of a man who had rehearsed something. He said he wanted to say a few words. He was grateful everyone had come. He was grateful for the year, for the opportunities, for the people in his life. He paused. Then he said that he had been thinking a lot lately about what it meant to be independent, to stand on your own, to not need anyone else's help to build a life. I watched Sarah. She was looking at her plate. Michael said that he was proud to say, and he wanted everyone to hear this, that he had reached a point where he was completely self-sufficient. He had his career, he had his apartment, he had his finances in order. He didn't need support from anyone. He said it with the particular emphasis of a man who is not talking to the room, but to one person in the room. He looked at Sarah when he said it. She didn't look up. Then he turned and looked at me. The room had gone quiet by then, 43 people, and the only sound was a server somewhere near the kitchen door setting something down on a tray. Michael's jaw was set. His voice, when he continued, was steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held very deliberately. He said that he had been thinking about this for a long time, that there were people in his life who represented the old way of doing things, people who didn't understand what he was building or who he was becoming, people who thought they could define him by what they gave him. He said it was time to be clear about that. He said it was time to draw a line. He looked at me and said, "Dad, you shouldn't be here. You're the past. You're a different generation. You don't understand what my life is. So I'm asking you to leave. Leave. Dad, you're not welcome here." The room held that for a moment, the way a room holds something it doesn't know what to do with. I counted 3 seconds. I know because I was watching the candle flame on the table between us, and it moved once, twice, 3 times in the air from the heating vent above. Susan Blackwell, at the adjacent table, had turned in her chair. I could see her in my peripheral vision. She was looking at Michael with an expression I recognized, not anger, not yet, but the particular stillness of someone who has just heard a person say something that they know to be completely false, and is deciding what to do with that knowledge. She had been in her kitchen 4 days ago. She had heard everything I told her. And now she was watching her daughter's boyfriend stand in front of 43 people and declare his independence from a man whose credit card had paid his rent 11 months out of the last 12. Sarah had not looked up from her plate. Greg, the man who had told me about his ski trip, was looking at his water glass. The woman across from him was looking at her hands. The server near the kitchen door had stopped moving. Then Susan Blackwell spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She simply turned in her chair toward Michael's table and said, in the clear, unhurried tone of a woman who has spent decades chairing meetings and is comfortable with rooms going quiet around her, "Michael, I think the account at First Western might have a different story." She said it the way you say something you have been waiting 4 days to say, not with anger, but with the particular precision of someone who has decided that accurate information matters more than comfortable silence. The room did not need to know what she meant. Michael knew. I could see it in the way his jaw shifted, a small, involuntary adjustment, the expression of a man who has just discovered that the room he thought was empty has been occupied all along. Sarah looked up from her plate for the first time. I picked up my napkin from my lap. I folded it along its original crease and set it on the table beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and stood. Michael was still standing. He was watching me with the expression of someone who had expected something different argument, maybe, or hurt, or the particular kind of father anger that would have confirmed everything he'd just said. I didn't give him any of those things. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Michael, I hope you enjoy your independence." I walked to the coat check, retrieved my coat, and walked out through the front entrance of the Cherry Creek Country Club into the November air. The valet asked if I needed my car. I said yes. I stood on the curb and waited, and the cold came through my jacket in the particular way Denver cold does in late November, direct and without apology. My car came around in 4 minutes. I tipped the valet, got in, and drove home on Colorado Boulevard. The house was dark except for the light my mother leaves on in the front hallway. I sat in the car in the driveway for perhaps 2 minutes, not thinking, exactly, just sitting. The engine ticked as it cooled. I went inside. I hung up my coat. I went to my office, sat at my desk, and found David Hartley's number in my phone. It was 8:47 in the evening. David picked up on the third ring. I told him I needed to freeze the joint account, the one with Michael's name on it, the one I had opened as the primary holder when Michael was 19 and needed help establishing credit. I told him I had the documentation. I told him I needed it done tonight. There was a pause. David said, "Tonight it's Thanksgiving." I said, "Tonight." Another pause. David had been the branch manager at that location for 9 years. He knew the account. He had seen the statements. When I had come in 3 weeks ago to review the authorization structure, he had looked at the numbers without expression and then looked at me and said, simply, "I understand." He was a careful man. He said, "Give me 45 minutes. I'll need to access the system remotely and generate the freeze confirmation. You'll get an email." I said that was fine. I thanked him. I sat at my desk and called Robert Chen. Robert answered immediately. He had been expecting a call, though not necessarily tonight. I told him what had happened and what I had just asked David to do. I told him I needed a formal letter, not a personal one, a legal one sent to Michael's email address by morning, something that explained, in precise language, the account ownership structure, the legal basis for the freeze, and what Michael's options were if he wished to contest it. I told him I wanted it to be complete and accurate and entirely without emotion. Robert said, "Are you certain about this?" I said, "I am." He said he would have a draft to me by midnight and would send it upon my approval. He asked if I wanted to include anything personal. I told him no. I told him the letter should say exactly what it needed to say, and nothing more. Robert said he understood. He had been my attorney for 14 years. He knew the difference between a message and a document. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my office. The house made the small sounds houses make at night, the furnace cycling, a branch against the window on the north side. I thought about Michael standing at that table, his jacket pressed, his voice steady, saying things that were not true to a room full of people who had no reason to disbelieve him. I thought about Sarah looking at her plate. I thought about Susan Blackwell turning in her chair. I thought about Patricia, my wife, and what she would have said. I had been thinking about that more often lately, not with the sharp grief of the first years, but with something quieter, a kind of consultation. She had known Michael in a way I sometimes struggled to access. She had seen both the best of him and the part that bent toward convenience. She had once told me, the winter before she got sick, that Michael would need to fail at something real before he could become someone real. I had disagreed with her then. I had thought she was being hard. I understood now that she had been being honest. The email from David arrived at 9:34. Account frozen, confirmation number, effective immediately. I read it twice and then closed my laptop. By midnight, Robert's draft was in my inbox. I read it, made one small correction to a date, and approved it. He sent it at 12:17 in the morning. Michael's phone would show the notification whenever he looked at it next. The account was frozen. Michael's debit card would be declined tomorrow morning when he stopped for coffee, or for groceries, or for whatever he reached for first. His rent check, which I knew from the bank statements was due on the 1st, would not clear. His car payment, set to auto draft on the 3rd, would fail. And somewhere in the process of those failures, the declined card, the call from his landlord, Thomas Wade, the letter from the financing company, he would begin to understand what independence actually required. Not the declaration of it, not the performance of it in front of 43 people at a country club in Cherry Creek. The thing itself. I turned off the desk lamp and went to check on my mother. She was asleep, her door open a few inches the way she preferred it. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her breathe. Then I went to bed. On the morning of November 24th, my phone showed 3 missed calls from Michael before 7 a.m. I had slept better than I expected. The first call came at 6:14, the second at 6:31, the third at 6:48. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and started the coffee. My mother was still asleep. The house was quiet in the way Denver houses get quiet the morning after a holiday. No traffic, no construction equipment, just the furnace cycling on and the faint sound of wind off the Rockies pressing against the windows. I drank my coffee standing up. I didn't sit down. Robert had sent the email at 11:52 the previous night, 40 minutes after I'd made the call to David Hartley. The email was 3 paragraphs, no more. It stated the legal basis for the account freeze, itemized the $47,000 in unauthorized credit draws, and noted that the account would remain frozen until Michael contacted Robert's office directly to begin a structured conversation about repayment and accountability. It did not say I was angry. It did not say I was disappointed. It said what was true in the language of documents, which is the only language that cannot be reinterpreted later. I had not written the email. Robert had. That was the point. Michael called David Hartley at 6:53 that morning. I know this because David called me at 7:10. He said, "James, I wanted you to know your son called the branch line. I told him the account was frozen by the primary account holder at 11:47 p.m. On November 23rd, he asked if there was an error. I told him there was no error." David paused. "He didn't say much after that?" I thanked him and told him I appreciated the call. David said, "I hope things work out." I told him I thought they would, eventually. At 7:22, Michael left a voicemail. I listened to it once. His voice was tight in the way voices get when someone is trying to sound controlled and isn't quite managing it. He said the account had been frozen. He said he needed money. He said to call him back immediately. The word immediately landed the way it always had with Michael, as though urgency was a substitute for accountability. I set the phone down and rinsed my coffee cup. I did not call back. I forwarded Robert's email to Michael's personal address at 7:35 and then put the phone in my desk drawer. The next 2 days came to me in pieces, through channels Michael didn't know I had. Thomas Wade, who owned the building on Larimer where Michael rented his apartment, had my number from the original lease co-signature 3 years ago. Thomas called on November 25th, a Tuesday. He said Michael had told him the December rent would be handled next week. Thomas said, "This is the 3rd time this year I've heard that." He wasn't asking me to intervene. He was telling me as a courtesy, the way you tell a man that a situation he already knows about is now visible to others. I thanked him. I told him Michael would need to work that out directly. The car came next. The financing company sent an automated notice to my email. I was still listed as a secondary contact from when I'd co-signed the lease 2 years ago, informing me that the November payment had failed and that repossession proceedings would begin in 48 hours if the balance was not cleared. I did not clear it. I forwarded the notice to Robert and asked him to note it in the file. On November 27th, Sarah called Michael. I don't know exactly what was said. I know it lasted 11 minutes because Michael told me later, and I know it ended with her hanging up because Susan Blackwell sent me a text that afternoon that said only she ended it this morning. I thought you should know. I read it at my desk, between two sets of drainage calculations for a retaining wall project in Aurora. I set the phone down and went back to the calculations. The numbers required my attention. The rest would take care of itself. Sarah called me that evening at 6:15. I almost didn't answer. I did. Her voice was steady, in the way that voices are steady when the crying has already happened, and what's left is the part that comes after. She said she wasn't calling to ask me to explain myself or to take sides. She said she was calling because she needed to say one thing out loud to someone who would understand it. She said, I saw the signs. I saw them, and I told myself he was just private about money, that it wasn't my business, that I was being suspicious for no reason. She stopped. I chose to believe him instead of what I was seeing. That's on me. I didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. I didn't tell her she couldn't have known. Those things were partly true, but they weren't what she needed. What she needed was for someone to hear her say it without arguing her out of it. I said, you trusted someone you loved. That's not a mistake. What you do with what you know now, that's the part that matters. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you for telling my mother the truth. She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Outside, the cottonwood was just bones against the evening sky. Michael's last call came on the evening of the 27th. By then, his voice had changed. The tightness was gone. What replaced it was something I hadn't heard from him in a long time, something that sounded like a 28-year-old man who had run out of performances and was left with only himself. He said he was sorry. He said it 3 times, which told me he meant it at least once. He said he was sorry for the lying, sorry for Thanksgiving, sorry for the things he'd said in front of people. He said he would pay back the money. He said he would do whatever it took. I let him finish. Then I said, Michael, you can start by telling the truth to Thomas Wade, to the financing company, and to the bank. Not a version of the truth. The truth. After that, we can talk. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, okay. I said, good night, Michael. I ended the call. 3 weeks passed. I heard from Robert twice and from Thomas Wade once more. Michael had gone to the bank and spoken with David directly without me present, without me arranging it, and had begun the paperwork for a personal repayment plan on the $47,000. He had called Thomas and told him the full situation. Thomas had given him a 30-day extension, which was Thomas's choice to make. The car was gone. Michael had surrendered it voluntarily before the repossession date, which was the first decision I'd seen him make that cost him something and didn't require me to be in the room. He moved to a smaller apartment on the east side of Capitol Hill, 2 rooms, street parking, a building that didn't have a doorman. I knew the address because he sent it to me in a text with no other message. I didn't respond to the text. I wrote it down on a notepad and put it in the drawer next to my reading glasses. In mid-December, I reopened the account, not the credit line that remained closed, the checking account with a balance of 0 and no automatic transfers. What went into it from that point forward would come from Michael's own paycheck, deposited by Michael's own hand, spent on Michael's own obligations. I sent him a single text. Account is open. Nothing is automatic anymore. He replied, I understand. I put the phone down and went back to the project drawings spread across my desk. My mother asked me about it one evening near Christmas. She was sitting in her chair by the window with a cup of tea she'd let go cold, and she asked me if I thought I'd done the right thing. I told her yes. She looked at me for a moment, the way she'd been looking at me for 62 years, with the particular patience of a woman who had watched people make decisions and then live inside them. She said, I know, but that doesn't make it easy. I said, no, it doesn't. She nodded and looked back out the window. The street was quiet. There was snow on the Subaru parked across from us, and the streetlight caught it in a way that made it look like something deliberate. I never told Michael I was sorry for what I'd done, not because I wasn't willing to sit with him in the difficulty of it, but because there was nothing to apologize for. He had mistaken my silence for weakness for years, and my support for an entitlement, and my patience for an absence of limits. All 3 of those mistakes had consequences. I had not created the consequences. I had simply stopped preventing them. I picked up my mother's cup and carried it to the kitchen. The coffee I'd made for myself 2 hours earlier was cold on the counter. I drank it anyway. Outside, the furnace clicked on. The drawings on my desk waited. I turned off the light above the sink and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle. Then I went back to work. I picked up my mother's cup and carried it to the kitchen. The coffee I'd made for myself 2 hours earlier was cold on the counter. I drank it anyway. Outside, the furnace clicked on. The drawings on my desk waited. I turned off the light above the sink and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle. Then I went back to work.